There are moments when love demands sacrifice, when caring for someone means accepting their pain as more important than your own comfort. And in August 2016, Sergeant First Class Brian Mitchell, a United States Army Ranger with 11 years of service, woke up in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany after an improvised explosive device had torn through his vehicle in Syria, woke up missing his left leg below the knee and with severe burns, covering 30% of his body. And the first thing he said when he regained consciousness was not about his injuries, was not about pain or prognosis, was 5 words spoken to his commanding officer who had flown to Germany to be at his bedside. 5 words that made no sense to anyone in that hospital room. He said, "Do not let Tolstoy see me." And his commander said, "What?" Said, "Who is Tolstoy?" And Brian said, "My cat. Do not let my cat see me like this. Promise me." And his commander promised, because you promise anything to a wounded soldier. And for 3 months, Brian refused to video call home, refused to let his wife Emma send him photos, insisted that Tolstoy could not see him until he looked like himself again. And everyone thought it was the trauma talking, thought Brian was confused or medicated or in shock. And it was not until Brian finally came home in November, not until he explained why he had made that request, that his family understood they had been witnessing not confusion, but the deepest act of love they had ever seen. Brian had found Tolstoy in 2014, had found him in Kabul, Afghanistan, during Brian's second deployment, and the cat had been maybe 4 months old, had been this scrawny gray tabby with enormous green eyes hiding in the rubble of a building that had been hit by mortar fire 2 days earlier. And Brian had been part of the team clearing the area, had been checking for survivors or secondary devices, and he had heard meowing, had heard this desperate crying sound coming from under collapsed concrete. And Brian had spent 40 minutes moving debris with his bare hands until he uncovered a small terrified kitten. And the kitten had been sitting next to the body of a little girl, had been sitting beside a child who had been maybe 6 years old. And Brian had picked up that kitten and carried him back to base. And that night Brian had sat in his bunk and held this trembling gray cat and cried for the first time since deploying. The rules said no pets, said absolutely no animals on base, said that adopting local animals was forbidden. But Brian's unit commander took 1 look at the cat and 1 look at Brian holding the cat and said, "I do not see any cat." Said, "As far as I am concerned, there is no animal here." And Tolstoy lived on that base for the next 4 months, lived in Brian's bunk, lived in the space between Brian's tactical vest and his chest during missions, when Brian could not leave him behind. And every soldier in that unit knew about the cat, and every soldier protected that secret because they understood that Tolstoy was doing something for Brian that nothing else could do, was keeping Brian human in a place designed to make you forget what humanity felt like. If you have ever loved something so much that you would endure pain to protect it from suffering, if you have ever understood that sometimes the strongest love is the love that asks for nothing in return, subscribe to this channel right now, because what Brian Mitchell did for a cat he rescued from a war zone will show you what sacrifice really means. Hit that like button if you believe that the bonds we form in our darkest moments are often the bonds that define us. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever chosen someone else's peace over their own comfort. Getting Tolstoy home to the United States had required 6 months of paperwork, had required vaccinations and health certificates and customs documentation. And Brian had worked on it obsessively during his deployment, had spent every free moment filling out forms and making calls. And when Brian finally came home in January 2015, when his deployment ended and he returned to Fort Benning in Georgia, Tolstoy came with him, flew in the cabin in a carrier that Brian had paid extra to keep under his seat. And Brian's wife Emma, who he had married 3 years earlier, met them at the airport. And Emma said, "So this is the famous cat you have been writing about?" And Brian said, "This is Tolstoy." And Emma said, "Why Tolstoy?" And Brian said, "Because he has seen war and he survived it, just like the writer." Emma noticed immediately that Brian's relationship with Tolstoy was not typical, was not the casual affection of pet ownership, was something deeper and more necessary. And Brian would have full conversations with the cat. would tell Tolstoy things he did not tell Emma, would sit with the cat for hours in silence, and Emma asked once what Brian talked about with Tolstoy, and Brian said, I tell him about the things I cannot tell you. Tell him about the girl, about finding him next to her body, about how he was the only good thing I found in that rubble. And Emma said, you can tell me those things. And Brian said, I know, but I do not want you to carry them. I want you to stay clean of it. And Emma understood that Tolstoy was carrying something for Brian, was holding memories that Brian could not hold alone. Tolstoy had his own trauma, had his own scars from what he had survived, and the cat could not tolerate sudden loud noises, would hide for hours if a door slammed, would panic if he heard fireworks or thunder. And Brian understood this, understood it in a way that Emma could not. And Brian would sit with Tolstoy during storms, would hold the cat and whisper to him, would say, I know what it sounds like. I know what you remember. And the cat would eventually calm, would press against Brian's chest and purr. And Emma would watch this and understand that they were healing each other, that Brian and Tolstoy were giving each other permission to be afraid. The night terrors started 6 months after Brian came home, started as dreams that would wake Brian screaming. And the first time it happened, Emma woke to find Brian sitting up in bed hyperventilating, with Tolstoy pressed against his chest. And Brian was saying, I am sorry I could not save her. And Emma understood he was talking about the girl, about the child who had died in that building. And she tried to comfort him, but Brian was somewhere else, was back in Kabul, and Tolstoy stayed there, stayed pressed against Brian until his breathing slowed, until he came back. And Emma said, does this happen a lot? And Brian said, only when I forget where I am, and Tolstoy helps me remember. Brian deployed again in 2016, deployed to Syria. And leaving Tolstoy was harder than leaving Emma, was harder than Brian wanted to admit. And the night before he left, Brian sat with the cat for 3 hours, sat in the dark garage, just the two of them. And Emma could hear Brian talking, but could not hear the words. And when Brian came inside, his eyes were red. And Emma said, what did you tell him? And Brian said, I told him I would come back. Told him I promised to come back. And Emma said, you told me the same thing. And Brian said, I know, but with Tolstoy it is different. He has already lost everyone once. I cannot let him lose anyone again. The explosion happened on August 14, 2016. Happened during a routine patrol in a neighborhood that intelligence said was secure. And Brian's vehicle hit an improvised explosive device that had been buried in the road. And the blast killed the driver instantly, killed the soldier in the passenger's seat. And Brian was in the back, and the angle of the explosion directed most of the force away from him, but not all of it. And he lost his leg and sustained burns and internal injuries, and they medevaced him to Germany. And when he woke up 3 days later, the first thing he thought about was not his leg, was not his future, was a gray cat waiting for him in Georgia. The commanding officer who visited Brian in Germany, a colonel named Patterson, who had served with Brian for 6 years, later told Emma that Brian's first words after regaining consciousness were about the cat, were this desperate plea to not let the cat see him. And Colonel Patterson had said, of course, had said, whatever you need. And Brian had grabbed Patterson's hand and said, you do not understand. Tolstoy cannot see bodies that are broken. He cannot see damage. It will take him back. It will remind him of the girl, of finding me next to someone dead. And Patterson had realized then that Brian was not talking about vanity or embarrassment, was talking about protecting an animal from psychological trauma. Emma wanted to video call, wanted to see her husband, wanted Brian to see her and Tolstoy. And Brian refused every time, refused for 3 weeks. And Emma would hold Tolstoy up to her phone screen and say, look at his Brian. Say hello. And Tolstoy would meow and search for Brian behind the phone, would look confused. And Emma would end the call crying because her husband was alive, but would not let her see him. And their friend said, he is probably disfigured, probably does not want you to see him until he is healed. And Emma said, it is not about me. He does not care if I see him. He only cares if the cat sees him. The burns healed slowly, healed over to months, and the amputation site healed faster, but required multiple surgeries to prepare for a prosthetic. And Brian spent those months in physical therapy and burn treatment and psychological counseling. And the therapist asked him about the cat. asked why it was so important that the animal not see him injured. And Brian tried to explain about Kabul, about the girl, about how Tolstoy's first memory of humans was finding Brian next to a dead child. And Brian said, if Tolstoy sees me broken and burned, it will look like that day. It will look like I am dying next to him, and I cannot do that to him. I cannot make him live through losing someone again. The therapist said that Brian was projecting, was assigning human emotions and memories to an animal. And Brian said, you did not see his eyes when I found him. You did not see what trauma looks like in something that small. And the therapist said cats do not have episodic memory the way humans do. Said they do not remember specific events with emotional context. And Brian said, then explain why he still hides during storms. Explain why loud noises send him into panic. Explain why he searches the house when someone is missing. And the therapist had no answer except to say that those are conditioned responses. And Brian said, then what I am doing is preventing a conditioned response. I am making sure he does not associate me with death. Emma flew to Germany in October. Flew to visit Brian before his medical transport back to the United States. And when she saw him, she understood why he had not wanted video calls. Understood that the burns were severe, that the scarring was extensive, that her husband looked like he had been through fire because he had. And Brian said, I know I look bad. And Emma said, you look alive. And Brian said, but Tolstoy cannot see me yet. I need more time. I need to look more like myself. And Emma said, the cat loves you. He will not care what you look like. And Brian said, you are wrong. He will care. He will see damage and he will remember damage, and I will not do that to him. Brian came home to Fort Benning on November 3, 2016. Came home via medical transport to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland first, and then to Fort Benning. And Emma had arranged for Tolstoy to stay with their neighbors while Brian settled in. And Brian insisted on this. Insisted that the cat could not come home until Brian was mobile, until he had his prosthetic and could walk without crutches. And Emma said, this is going to take months. And Brian said, then it takes months. And Emma said, you are being ridiculous. And Brian said, I am being protective. There is a difference. The prosthetic fitting began in December, began with measurements and castings and adjustments. And learning to walk on a prosthetic leg is exhausting, is painful, requires relearning balance and weight distribution, and Brian worked at it obsessively. Worked because he wanted to walk normally before Tolstoy came home. Wanted the cat to see him standing and moving like he used to move. And the physical therapist said, you are pushing too hard. Said you need to let your body adapt gradually. And Brian said, I have a deadline. And the therapist said, what deadline? And Brian said, I need to be walking by Christmas because that is when my cat comes home. Emma thought Brian was being irrational, thought his focus on the cat was a way of avoiding processing his own trauma. And she said this to the psychologist at Walter Reed who was working with Brian on post-traumatic stress disorder. And the psychologist said it is possible, said that focusing on protecting someone else can be a way of not confronting your own pain. But it is also possible that this is how Brian processes love, that for him love means sacrifice, means protecting others from suffering even at cost to himself. And Emma said, but he is making his own recovery harder. He is pushing himself beyond safe limits. And the psychologist said yes. And that tells you how much he loves that cat. Brian was walking with a cane by mid-December, was walking with a noticeable limp but walking. And the burn scars were still visible, but had faded from angry red to pale pink. And Brian looked in the mirror and said, I think I am ready. And Emma said, ready for what? And Brian said, ready for Tolstoy to come home. And Emma called their neighbors and arranged for the cat to be returned the next day. And that night Brian could not sleep, laid awake planning how to present himself to the cat, planning how to make sure his rival home looked normal and safe. The neighbor brought Tolstoy over at 10 in the morning, brought him in his carrier. And Brian had insisted on being in the backyard when the cat arrived, had insisted on being outside doing something normal. And he was sitting in a lawn chair reading a book when Emma brought Tolstoy outside. And she opened the carrier and Tolstoy stepped out cautiously, looked around, and then saw Brian, and the cat froze. And Brian said, hey buddy, I am home. And he stayed sitting, stayed calm. And Tolstoy walked toward him slowly, walked the way cats walk when they are uncertain. And then Tolstoy was at Brian's chair, and Brian reached down and the cat jumped into his lap and pressed against his chest and started purring so loudly that Emma could hear it. From 10 feet away, Brian held Tolstoy and cried, held him and said, "I told you I would come back. I promised you I would come back." And the cat pushed his head under Brian's chin. And Emma watched this reunion and understood finally what Brian had been protecting. Understood that Brian had spent for months in pain and difficulty and separation. Because he needed this moment to feel normal. Needed Tolstoy to see him as whole. And Emma said later that she had never seen love like that. Had never seen someone endure so much to protect someone else's sense of safety. Over the next week, Emma watched Brian and Tolstoy reestablish their routine. Watched them fall back into the patterns they had before Brian deployed. And Brian would sit with the cat for hours, would talk to him the way he always had. And one night Emma heard Brian say to Tolstoy, "I am sorry I was gone so long. I am sorry I made you wait." And the cat meowed. And Brian said, "I know, but I needed to make sure I looked okay. Needed to make sure you would not be scared." And Emma realized that Brian was explaining himself to the cat, was apologizing for staying away. Tolstoy began exhibiting strange behavior about 2 weeks after Brian came home. Began following Brian everywhere. Began crying when Brian went into the bathroom alone. Began sleeping directly on Brian's prosthetic leg at night. And Emma said, "I think he knows something is different. I think he knows about your leg." And Brian said, "Of course he knows. Cats are not stupid. But knowing and seeing are different. He knows I am different, but he did not have to watch me be broken." And Emma said, "You really think that matters?" And Brian said, "I know it matters." The nightmares that had plagued Brian before his deployment came back worse after he returned. Came back with new material, new images, and Brian would wake up screaming about fire, about being trapped, about watching the driver die. And every time this happened, Tolstoy would be there immediately, would climb onto Brian's chest and press down with his paws and purr. And Emma said, "The cat is doing the same thing you do for him during storms." And Brian said, "I know. We take turns saving each other." The Veterans Affairs assigned Brian a therapist who specialized in combat trauma, assigned him to weekly sessions, and Brian talked about the explosion, about losing soldiers, about survivor guilt. But he also talked about Tolstoy, talked about why he had refused to let the cat see him injured. And the therapist said, "Tell me about the day you found him." And Brian described pulling debris off a kitten sitting next to a dead child. And the therapist said, "And you think the cat remembers that day?" And Brian said, "I know he remembers. I can see it in how he acts. I can see trauma in an animal the same way I can see it in soldiers." And the therapist said, "So, by not letting him see you injured, you were." And Brian finished the sentence, "I was preventing him from associating me with death again. I was making sure his memory of me stayed safe." Emma asked Brian once if he regretted it. Asked if looking back he thought staying away from Tolstoy for months was worth it. And Brian said, "It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than losing my leg, harder than the burns. But yes, it was worth it, because when Tolstoy saw me that first day, he was not afraid. He was not confused. He just came to me like I had never left. And that moment was worth every day I spent away from him." And Emma said, "You love that cat more than anything." And Brian said, "I love that cat as much as I love you. I just love you differently. You are my future, and he is my survivor. We survived the same war, and we understand each other in ways no one else can understand." The marriage counselor that Emma insisted they see 6 months after Brian returned asked about the cat. Asked because Emma had mentioned how much of Brian's emotional energy went to Tolstoy. And the counselor asked Brian if he thought his focus on the cat was preventing him from connecting with Emma. And Brian said no, said the opposite. Said that Tolstoy allows me to process the things I cannot process with Emma. Allows me to keep the war separated from my marriage. And the counselor said, "Explain that." And Brian said, "There are things I saw and did that Emma should never have to know about. Things that would change how she sees the world. And Tolstoy already knows those things. He was there. So I can talk to him about it, and Emma stays clean." Emma said she did not want to stay clean. Said she wanted to know everything. Wanted to carry Brian's burdens with him. And Brian said, "I know you think you want that, but you do not. You want to live in a world where children do not die in bombings, where buildings do not collapse on families, where soldiers do not burn to death. And I can give you that world by keeping those stories between me and Tolstoy." And Emma started crying and said, "I want to help you." And Brian said, "You do help me. You help me by being the reason I came home. Tolstoy helps me by being the one who understands why coming home was hard." A year after Brian returned, a year after that first reunion in the backyard, Emma found Brian in the garage at 2 in the morning sitting with Tolstoy. And Brian was showing the cat his prosthetic leg, was showing him the scars, was saying, "See, I am okay. Everything works. I am still me." And Emma watched from the doorway and understood that Brian was finally ready to show Tolstoy what he had protected him from seeing, was ready because enough time had passed that the injuries looked like history instead of crisis. And Brian saw Emma watching and said, "I needed him to see this eventually, needed him to know what happened. But I needed time to make it look like something I survived instead of something I was dying from." Emma asked what difference that made, asked why timing mattered if Tolstoy was going to see the injuries eventually. And Brian said, because trauma is about context, about how something is presented. And if Tolstoy had seen me right after the explosion, he would have seen me as a victim, as someone who was broken. But now he sees me as someone who survived, as someone who is whole even though parts are different. And there is a huge psychological difference between those two things. And Emma said, "For you or for him?" And Brian said, "For both of us." The prosthetic technology improved over the years, improved to the point where Brian could run again by 2018, could run slowly, but could run. And the first time he ran with Tolstoy following him around the backyard, Emma filmed it. Filmed Brian jogging in awkward circles with a gray cat trotting behind him. And Brian was laughing, was calling back to the cat saying, "Keep up, old man." And Tolstoy was meowing, and Emma was crying because this moment, this ridiculous moment of a man and a cat running in circles, was the moment she knew Brian was going to be okay. Other veterans started hearing about Brian's story, started hearing about the soldier who had refused to let his cat see him injured. And they would reach out through military networks, would send messages saying they understood, saying they had done similar things, had hidden injuries from pets or children, had tried to protect the innocent from witnessing their damage. And Brian started talking to these veterans, started a small online group for combat veterans with pets, and they would share stories about how their animals helped them process trauma. And Brian would talk about Tolstoy, about protection, about how sometimes love means enduring separation to preserve someone else's peace. One of these veterans, a Marine named Rodriguez, who had lost both arms in Afghanistan, said he had done the opposite, said he had let his dog see him immediately after his injuries, and the dog had been terrified, had not recognized him, had taken weeks to trust him again. And Rodriguez said, "I wish I had waited like you did. Wish I had given myself time to seem normal before seeing my dog, because now my dog associates me with that hospital smell, with weakness." And Brian said, "Animals remember context. They remember how we appear in moments of crisis. And if we can control that first impression, we can shape how they understand our survival." A psychologist who specialized in animal-assisted therapy reached out to Brian in 2019. Reached out because she had heard about his story and wanted to interview him for a paper. She was writing about the therapeutic relationships between combat veterans and pets. And Brian agreed to be interviewed, and the psychologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, spent 3 hours asking him about Tolstoy, about the decision to stay away, about how the cat helped him process trauma. And Dr. Chen said, "Your case is unique because most research focuses on how animals help humans. But you made a decision to prioritize the animal's psychological well-being over your own need for comfort. And that reverses the typical therapeutic dynamic." Dr. Chen published a paper in 2020 titled "Protective Separation, a Case Study in Veteran-Animal Trauma Bonding." And the paper detailed Brian's story, detailed his decision to remain separated from Tolstoy for months, to prevent the cat from experiencing renewed trauma. And the paper argued that this represented a sophisticated understanding of animal psychology, represented Brian recognizing that Tolstoy had his own post-traumatic stress disorder from being found in a bombing, and that seeing Brian severely injured could trigger that trauma. And the paper concluded that the relationship between Brian and Tolstoy was not just therapeutic for Brian, but was mutually protective, Was both of them working to keep each other stable? The paper got attention in both veterinary psychology circles and military psychology circles. Got attention because it challenged assumptions about the directionality of therapeutic relationships, and Dr. Chen was invited to present at conferences, and she would tell Brian's story, would talk about a ranger who loved a cat enough to endure months of separation, and audiences would ask if Brian's decision had actually helped or if it had been unnecessary, if Tolstoy would really have been traumatized by seeing Brian injured. And Dr. Chen would say, we cannot know for certain, but what we know is that Brian believed it would help, and that belief shaped his behavior, and the outcome was a cat who remained stable and a veteran, who felt he had protected someone he loved. And sometimes the belief in protection is as important as the protection itself. Brian medically retired from the Army in 2019. Retired with full disability and a Purple Heart and a drawer full of commendations. And he started working as a counselor at a veterans center. Started working with recently returned combat veterans who were struggling with transition. And Brian would tell them about Tolstoy. Would say that finding something to protect can be more healing than being protected. Would say that his recovery really began not when he accepted help, but when he decided to prioritize someone else's well-being over his own comfort. And the veterans would ask how a cat could matter that much. And Brian would say, if you have to ask, then you have never loved something that survived the same trauma you survived. Tolstoy developed kidney disease in 2020. Developed it at age 10, which was earlier than expected. And the veterinarian said it was likely stress-related. Likely the result of early life trauma combined with the stress of Brian's deployment and injury. And Emma said, so the war hurt him too. And the vet said yes. Trauma affects animals just like it affects humans. It can manifest in physical illness years later. And Brian heard this and said, so I was right. I was right to keep him from seeing me broken. Because if he was already carrying trauma from Kabul, then adding more trauma could have been catastrophic. And Emma said, you cannot know that. And Brian said, but I can believe it, and belief is enough. The kidney disease was manageable with medication and special diet. Was something Tolstoy could live with for years. And Brian administered the medications twice daily, would wrap pills in treats and hand feed them to the cat. And Brian would say, you took care of me, and now I take care of you. And the cat would purr, and Emma would watch this and think about cycles of care, about how love is sometimes about taking turns being strong. In 2021, a documentary filmmaker reached out to Brian. Reached out because she was making a film about combat veterans and their relationships with animals. And she wanted to feature Brian and Tolstoy. And Brian agreed on the condition that the film not show his injuries graphically, not show the burn scars or the amputation in ways that were exploitative. And the filmmaker agreed, and she came to their home in Georgia and filmed for 3 days. Filmed Brian talking about Kabul, about finding Tolstoy, about the explosion, about the decision to stay away, and Brian was articulate and clear. And the filmmaker said, you have thought about this a lot. And Brian said, I think about it every day. Think about what it means to love something that has suffered. The documentary, titled Mutual Rescue, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2022, and Brian and Emma attended. And they sat in a theater full of people and watched Brian's story on a screen 20 feet tall. And when the segment about Brian refusing to let Tolstoy see him injured played, when Brian's voice explained about wanting to protect the cat from associating him with death, the entire theater was silent. And when the lights came up, half the audience was crying. And people came up to Brian afterward and said they had never understood that love could look like that, could look like choosing pain to prevent someone else's fear. The documentary won awards, won an Audience Choice Award at Tribeca and Best Short Documentary at 3 other festivals. And Brian did interviews about it. Did interviews where journalists would ask him if he had any regrets about his decision. And Brian's answer was always the same. He would say, the only regret I have is that I had to make that decision at all. That Tolstoy and I both had to survive trauma. But given that we did survive it, I would make the same choice again. I would choose to protect him every time, because that is what love is. Love is not needing someone to make you feel better. Love is wanting someone else to feel safe. Emma gave a speech at a military family support event in 2022. gave a speech where she talked about what it was like to be married to Brian, to be married to someone whose deepest relationship was with a cat he had rescued from a war zone. And Emma said there were times I was jealous, times I wished Brian would talk to me the way he talked to Tolstoy, times I wished he would show me the vulnerability he showed the cat. And then I realized that Brian was not choosing Tolstoy over me. He was using Tolstoy to protect me. He was keeping the darkest parts of war contained in a relationship with someone who had been there. And that was not rejection, that was love. And Emma said that if your veteran has an animal that they seem closer to than they are to you, understand that the animal is not replacing you. The animal is carrying things for them so that you do not have to. A researcher from Cornell University reached out to Brian in 2023. Reached out because she was studying the long-term effects of animal companionship on veteran mental health outcomes, and she wanted to include Brian in a longitudinal study. And Brian agreed, and he filled out surveys about his mental health, about his relationship with Tolstoy, about how the cat had affected his recovery. And the surveys asked questions like, does your pet provide emotional support? And Brian would write yes, and then the survey would ask follow-up questions. And Brian wrote in margins, wrote things like, you are asking the wrong questions. You are asking if my pet helps me, but you should be asking if I help my pet. You should be asking if the relationship is mutual. The researcher, Dr. Amanda Foster, read Brian's comments and reached out directly. And they had a phone conversation where Brian explained his theory that therapeutic animal relationships are not hierarchical, are not about animals serving human needs, but are about mutual recognition of trauma, about two beings who have survived similar things taking care of each other. And Dr. Foster said this is not how we typically frame animal therapy. And Brian said, I know, and that is why your research is missing something important. You are treating animals like tools when they are actually partners. And Dr. Foster said, would you be willing to co-author a paper about this? And Brian said, yes, if you let me write the section about why I stayed away from my cat, because that is the part that matters most. The paper was published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress in late 2023, was titled Reciprocal Protection in Veteran-Animal Relationships, Moving Beyond Service Models, and it used Brian's case as the primary example of what the authors called mutual trauma recognition. The idea that animals who have experienced trauma can recognize trauma in humans and vice versa, and that relationships built on this recognition are fundamentally different from traditional service animal relationships, because both parties are actively working to protect each other. And the paper argued that these relationships should be studied differently, should be understood as partnerships rather than therapeutic interventions. The paper got pushback from some researchers who argued that anthropomorphizing animal emotions was scientifically irresponsible, who argued that Brian was projecting human psychological complexity onto a cat. And Brian responded in a follow-up interview by saying, I am not saying Tolstoy understands trauma the way I understand trauma. I am saying he experienced trauma, and his behavior reflects that experience. And my behavior toward him reflects my recognition of his experience. And whether he cognitively understands what he is doing is less important than the fact that what he is doing works, that our relationship has kept both of us stable. And if science cannot explain that, then science needs better tools. Tolstoy's kidney disease progressed slowly over 2023, progressed to the point where the veterinarian said they were managing it, but not curing it, said that eventually the kidneys would fail and Brian would have to make decisions about quality of life. And Brian said how long, and the vet said months, maybe a year. And Brian went home and sat with Tolstoy and said, we have more time. You and me, we have more time. And the cat purred. And Brian said, when it is time, I will know. You will tell me when you are ready. And Emma heard this and said, how will he tell you? And Brian said, I will know, because he will look at me the way I looked at him when I was in Germany. He will ask me not to let him suffer. Brian started preparing for Tolstoy's death in early 2024. Started preparing the way he prepares for any mission. Started making lists and plans, and Emma said, you cannot plan grief. And Brian said, I am not planning grief, I am planning care. I am making sure that when the time comes, I do everything right. And Emma asked, what does right look like? And Brian said, right looks like Tolstoy being comfortable, being pain-free, being surrounded by people who love him. Right looks like him not being scared, And Emma said, "How do you know he will be scared?" And Brian said, "Because I was scared when I thought I was dying. Because fear is what happens when you know something is ending, and I will not let him be afraid." In March 2020, Tolstoy stopped eating for 2 days. And the vet said this is often the beginning of the end with kidney disease. Said the toxins build up and they lose appetite. And they gave Brian medications to stimulate appetite, and Brian tried everything. Tried every food, every treat, and Tolstoy would smell the food and walk away. And on day 3, Brian sat on the floor with Tolstoy in his lap and said, "Are you ready? Is it time?" And the cat looked at him, and Brian said, "I understand." And Emma said, "Understand what?" And Brian said, "He is telling me he is done. He is ready." Brian made an appointment with a veterinarian who did home euthanasia. Made an appointment for 2 days later, and he spent those 2 days with Tolstoy. Spent them sitting with the cat, talking to him, telling him stories. And Emma would hear Brian say, "Do you remember Kabul? Do you remember when I found you? Do you remember the flights home?" And Brian was reciting their history together, was giving the cat a narrative of their life. And Emma asked why he was doing this, and Brian said, "Because I want him to know his story. Want him to die knowing that his life mattered, that he was loved, that he saved me as much as I saved him." The night before the appointment, Brian carried Tolstoy outside, carried him to the backyard where they had their first reunion 8 years earlier. And Brian sat in the same lawn chair and held the cat and looked at the stars. And Emma watched from the window, and she could see Brian crying, could see him holding Tolstoy against his chest the way he had held him that first day, home from Germany. And she wanted to go outside, wanted to be part of this goodbye. But she understood that this was between them, that Brian and Tolstoy had a relationship that existed in a space she could not enter, a space built from shared trauma and mutual protection. The veterinarian arrived at 10 in the morning, arrived with an assistant and a bag of medical supplies. And Brian had arranged the living room carefully, had placed blankets on the couch and opened the curtains so sunlight came in. And he held Tolstoy in his lap, and the veterinarian explained the process, explained that there would be 2 injections, one to sedate and one to stop the heart. And Brian said, "I understand. I have done this before." And the vet looked confused, and Brian said, "I was a medic before I was a ranger. I know what dying looks like." And the vet said, "Okay, then you know he will not feel pain." And Brian said, "I know, but thank you for saying it." Emma sat beside Brian on the couch, sat with her hand on his shoulder, and the veterinarian gave the first injection, the sedative, and Tolstoy relaxed in Brian's arms, relaxed and looked up at Brian's face. And Brian said, "I am right here. I am not leaving. You are safe." And the cat's eyes started to close, and Brian said, "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for letting me save you. Thank you for saving me back." And the veterinarian gave the second injection, and Tolstoy died within seconds. Died in Brian's arms the way Brian had always promised he would be there. Brian held the body for 20 minutes after Tolstoy died. Held him and cried in a way Emma had never seen him cry. Cried the way people cry when something essential has been torn away. And Emma held Brian and said nothing because there was nothing to say. And finally Brian said, "Okay, I am ready." And the veterinarian and her assistant took Tolstoy's body, took it for cremation. And Brian stood up and walked to the backyard, and Emma followed. And Brian stood in the place where he had first reunited with Tolstoy and said, "That was the hardest thing I have ever done." And Emma said, "Harder than losing your leg." And Brian said, "So much harder, because my leg did not choose to love me." The cremated remains came back a week later. Came in a wooden box with Tolstoy's name engraved on a brass plate. And Brian placed the box on a shelf in his office next to a photo of him and Tolstoy from 2015. A photo of them both looking at the camera. And Brian would sit in his office and talk to the box the way he used to talk to the cat. Would tell Tolstoy about his day, about the veterans he was counseling, about how he was trying to pass on what Tolstoy had taught him about survival and mutual care. A month after Tolstoy died, Emma found Brian in the garage at 2 in the morning. Found him sitting in the dark, and Emma said, "What are you doing?" And Brian said, "I am trying to figure out who I tell things to now. I am trying to figure out where I put the things I cannot say to anyone else." And Emma said, "You can tell me." And Brian said, "I know, but it is not the same. Tolstoy carried things because he had been there, because he understood without me having to explain. And now those things do not have a place to go. And Emma sat beside him and said, then tell me anyway. Tell me even though I was not there. Tell me, and let me try to understand. Ryan started talking, started telling Emma about Kabul in ways he had never told her before. Told her about the little girl whose body he had found next to Tolstoy. Told her that the girl had been wearing a blue dress, that she had been holding a doll, that Brian had closed her eyes before moving her body. And Emma listened and cried and said, I am sorry. I am sorry you saw that. And Brian said Tolstoy saw it too. Tolstoy was sitting next to her for hours before I found him. And that is why I could not let him see me dying. Because he had already seen death, and I needed him to see that I was different, that I survived. Emma asked if Brian regretted staying away from Tolstoy for months. Asked now that she understood the full story if he thought it had been the right choice. And Brian said it was the only choice. It was the most important thing I have ever done. Because those 4 months of pain meant 8 years of peace. 8 years where Tolstoy did not flinch when he looked at me. 8 years where he felt safe. And that trade was worth it, would always be worth it. And Emma said you loved him more than I understood. And Brian said I loved him the way you love someone who sees the worst parts of you and stays anyway. 6 months after Tolstoy died, Brian got a call from a young army specialist who had just returned from deployment, who had found Brian's name through the Veteran Support Network. And the specialist said, I have a dog I found in Iraq, and I got hurt bad, and I am in the hospital, and they want me to video call home, and my family wants to see me. But my dog is there, and I do not want him to see me like this. And Brian said, why? And the specialist said, because he has been through enough. He does not need to see me broken. And Brian said, where are you? And the specialist told him. And Brian said, I am coming there. We need to talk. Brian flew to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center the next day. Flew to see this specialist he had never met. And he found the young soldier in a bed in the recovery ward with burns on his face and arms, and a shattered leg. And the specialist said, thank you for coming. Thank you for understanding. And Brian pulled a chair close to the bed and said, tell me about your dog. And the specialist, whose name was Marcus, said his name is Scout. I found him in a market that had been bombed. He was the only thing alive in that whole block. And Brian said, I know that story. I have lived that story. Marcus said, everyone thinks I am being stupid. Thinks I am making my recovery harder by refusing to see my dog. And my family is angry. And my girlfriend does not understand. And the doctors think I am having a breakdown. And Brian said, you are not having a breakdown. You are protecting someone you love from trauma. And that is not stupid. That is the sanest thing you can do. And Marcus started crying and said, finally someone who gets it. And Brian said, I get it because I did the same thing. I stayed away from my cat for 4 months because I did not want him to see me damaged. Brian spent 3 hours with Marcus that day. Spent 3 hours telling him about Tolstoy, about Kabul, about the decision to stay away, about the reunion, about the 8 years they had together after. And Marcus listened and asked questions and said, did it work? Was it worth it? And Brian said it was the hardest thing I ever did, and yes, it was worth it. Every day of separation was worth the peace Mike had had when he finally saw me. And Marcus said, how long should I wait? And Brian said, until you can stand. Until you can move without looking like you are in crisis. Until you look like someone who survived instead of someone who is dying. Brian visited Marcus 3 more times over the next month. Visited as Marcus healed and learned to walk on a damaged leg. And they would talk about their animals, about trauma, about what it means to love something that has seen war. And Marcus said, you are the only person who does not think I am crazy. And Brian said, that is because I am the only person who has made the same choice, who has loved something enough to prioritize its mental health over my own need for comfort. And Marcus said, I cannot wait to see Scout. And Brian said, I know, but the waiting is the gift. The waiting is how you love him. Marcus went home in April 2024, went home to North Carolina, and he had asked Brian to be there when he reunited with Scout. Had asked if Brian would come witness the moment. And Brian flew to North Carolina and was there when Marcus's family brought Scout to the backyard. And Marcus was standing with crutches but standing. And Scout came running and stopped 3 feet away and looked at Marcus with confusion. And Marcus knelt down slowly and said, "Hey buddy, I am home." And the dog approached carefully and sniffed Marcus and then jumped on him with joy. And Brian watched this and saw Tolstoy, saw his own reunion 8 years earlier, and he was crying. Marcus called Brian a week later and said, "You were right. He does not see me as broken. He sees me as home." And Brian said that is what the waiting gives you. Gives them a context of wholeness instead of a context of crisis. And Marcus said, "I am going to do what you do. I am going to help other veterans understand this." And Brian said, "Good. Because there are more people like us than anyone realizes. More veterans who need permission to protect their animals from witnessing their damage." Brian started speaking at military events in 2024. Started giving talks about his experience with Tolstoy, about protective separation, about mutual trauma recognition. And at one event, a general approached him after and said, "Your story has changed. How we think about animal therapy programs has changed how we counsel returning soldiers about their pets." And Brian said, "Good. Because for too long we have treated animals as tools for our healing, when they are actually partners in survival." And the general said the military is developing new protocols based on your case. Protocols that give soldiers permission to delay reunions with their animals if they believe it will protect the animal from trauma. Emma noticed that Brian talked about Tolstoy constantly after his death, talked about him more than he had when the cat was alive, and she asked why. And Brian said, "Because when he was alive I could show him I loved him. I could sit with him and hold him, and we had our routine. But now all I have are words. All I can do is tell his story. And telling his story is how I keep him alive, how I make sure other people understand what he meant." And Emma said he meant everything. And Brian said, "Yes, he meant everything. He meant that love is not just about being together. Sometimes love is about staying away until you can be together safely." A sculptor reached out to Brian in mid-2024. Reached out because she was creating a memorial installation for a military museum, and she wanted to include a piece about Brian and Tolstoy. And Brian said, "What kind of piece?" And she said, "A life-size bronze sculpture of a soldier sitting in a lawn chair holding a cat. A sculpture of the moment you reunited after staying away for months." And Brian said, "Yes, yes, I want that. I want people to see what that moment looked like. Want them to understand that this is what coming home really means." The sculpture was unveiled in October 2024 at the National Veterans Museum in Chicago. Unveiled at a ceremony attended by 200 veterans and their families. And the sculpture showed Brian sitting with Tolstoy pressed against his chest, showed the cat's face tucked under Brian's chin, showed Brian's prosthetic leg visible but not prominent. And the plaque beside the sculpture read, "Protective Love, SFC Brian Mitchell and Tolstoy, 2016. And below that it said, "Sometimes the deepest love means staying away until you can return safely." And Brian stood in front of this sculpture of himself and cried because it was permanent now. The story was permanent. Tolstoy was permanent. Asterisk veterans started reaching out to Brian after the sculpture was unveiled. Started reaching out with their own stories of protective separation. Stories of staying away from pets or children because they did not want them to witness injury or trauma. And Brian created a support group, created an online community called Protective Hearts. And it was a space for veterans to talk about the animals they were protecting, about the decisions they were making to shield their loved ones from their damage. And the group grew to 500 members in 6 months. Grew because people needed permission to love this way, needed to know they were not alone. A veteran in the group, a woman named Sarah who had lost an arm in Afghanistan, posted about how she had been refusing to video call her cat for 2 months because she did not want him to see her in a hospital bed. And other members encouraged her, told her about their own experiences, told her that waiting was an act of love. And Sarah waited until she was home and mobile before bringing her cat back. And she posted photos of the reunion and said, "You were all right. He saw me as whole. He was not afraid." And Brian commented on the post and said, "This is what we do for each other. We give each other permission to protect." Emma asked Brian in late 2024 if he would ever get another cat, if he thought he could love another animal after Tolstoy. And Brian said, "I do not know. I do not know if I have room for another relationship like that." And Emma said, "What do you mean?" And Brian said, "Tolstoy was not a pet. He was my brother in survival. We went through war together and came out together. And I do not know if I can build that with another animal. I do not know if I want to. And Emma said so he is irreplaceable. And Brian said completely irreplaceable. But Brian started volunteering at an animal shelter in early 2025. Started volunteering specifically with animals who had behavioral issues, animals who had been traumatized, animals who were considered unadoptable. And he would sit with these animals, would talk to them, would say, I know what you have been through. I can see it in how you move, how you react. And the shelter staff said you have a gift for this. Said the animals respond to you differently. And Brian said that is because I am not trying to fix them. I am just trying to let them know they are not alone. One of the cats at the shelter, a scarred gray tabby who had been found in a hoarding situation, reminded Brian of Tolstoy. Reminded him in the way the cat sat in the back of his kennel, watching everything with wary intelligence. And Brian would visit this cat every week, would sit outside the kennel and read to him, would talk to him about Tolstoy, about survival, about how trauma does not have to be permanent. And after 3 months the cat started approaching the front of the kennel when Brian arrived, started meowing at him, and Brian said to Emma, I think he is ready. And Emma said, ready for what? And Brian said, ready to come home. Brian adopted the gray tabby in March 2025, adopted him and named him Tolstoy. Named him the same name because Brian said he is not a replacement. He is a continuation. He is another survivor who needs someone who understands. And Emma said, are you sure about this? And Brian said, no, I am not sure. But I am sure that this cat needs me and I have room for him. And that is enough. And they brought Tolstoy II home. And he hid under the bed for 3 days. And Brian would sit on the floor next to the bed and talk to him, would say, I know you are scared. I know you do not trust this yet. And that is okay. Take your time. Tolstoy II came out from under the bed on day 4. Came out cautiously, and Brian was sitting in the living room reading. And the cat approached slowly and sat 6 feet away and stared at Brian. And Brian did not move, did not reach for him. Just said, hello, you are safe here. And the cat sat there for an hour watching. And then he walked closer. And then he was at Brian's feet. And then he jumped into Brian's lap. And Brian held very still and said, okay, we can do this. And the cat settled there, and Brian put his hand on the cat's back and felt the cat relax. And he said to Emma, who was watching, he is going to be okay. We are both going to be okay. The nightmares came back after Brian adopted Tolstoy II. Came back with the same intensity they had after he first came home from Germany. And Emma asked why, asked if the new cat was triggering memories. And Brian said yes, said adopting him brought everything back. Brought back Kabul and the little girl and finding the first Tolstoy. And I thought I was past it. Thought I had processed it. But apparently I have not. And Emma said maybe this was too soon. And Brian said maybe, but the cat needs me now. Not in 6 months when I am more healed. And so we will heal together. Tolstoy II had his own nightmares, would wake up yowling. And Brian would go to him and pick him up and hold him and say, I know what it is like to be afraid of your own memories. And the cat would eventually calm. And Emma watched this happen night after night. Watched Brian and this traumatized cat take turns comforting each other. And she understood that Brian had been right. That this was not about replacing Tolstoy I. This was about Brian continuing to do what he knew how to do, which was to love something that had survived trauma. Brian started bringing Tolstoy II to the Veterans Center where he worked. Started bringing him to counseling sessions with veterans who were struggling. And the cat would sit in the room while Brian talked to these veterans. And something about the cat's presence changed the sessions, made veterans more willing to talk, more willing to admit they were struggling. And Brian would say this cat was in a bad situation, was traumatized and scared. And now he is here and he is okay, and you can be okay too. And veterans would reach out to pet the cat, and Brian would say he does not like sudden movements. You have to let him come to you. And the veterans would wait. And the cat would approach, and Brian would say, see, patience, that is how trust works. A documentary crew came back in 2025. Came back to film a follow-up to the 2022 documentary. Came to document Brian's life after Tolstoy's death. And they filmed Brian with Tolstoy II, filmed the Veterans Center sessions. filmed Emma talking about what it was like to watch her husband grieve and then adopt another traumatized cat. And the filmmaker said, "This is a different story now. This is not just about protective love. This is about continuing to love after loss." And Brian said it is the same story. It has always been about choosing to love things that have been damaged, choosing to protect them, choosing to show up even when it is hard. The follow-up documentary, titled Tolstoy After, premiered in 2026, and it showed Brian's journey from losing Tolstoy I to adopting Tolstoy II, showed his work with veterans, showed the Protective Hearts support group, showed veterans from around the country talking about how Brian's story had given them permission to prioritize their animals' emotional well-being. And the documentary ended with Brian sitting in his backyard with Tolstoy II, sitting in the same lawn chair where he had reunited with Tolstoy the first 10 years earlier. And Brian said to the camera, "If you love something that has been traumatized, remember that how you present yourself matters, that context matters, that sometimes staying away until you can be strong is the deepest expression of love." And I stayed away from my cat for months because I loved him too much to let him see me broken. And I would do it again, would do it 1,000 times, because that is what love is. Love is protecting someone else's peace even when you desperately need comfort yourself. The documentary won awards again, won Best Feature Documentary at multiple festivals, and Brian did a press tour, did interviews where journalists would ask him about the decision to adopt another Tolstoy, would ask if he was trying to replace the first, and Brian's answer was always the same. He would say, "You cannot replace someone you love. You can only honor them by continuing to love the way they taught you to love." And Tolstoy taught me that love is about protection, about recognizing trauma, about creating safety. And so I am doing that again with another cat who needs it. And in doing that I am keeping Tolstoy alive. Emma gave birth to their first child in 2027, gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, and Brian was terrified that he would not know how to be a father, that his trauma would damage his child. And Emma said, "You know how to protect people. You know how to create safety. You'll be a good father." And Brian said, "But what if I am not? What if she sees the broken parts of me?" And Emma said, "Then she will see that broken people can still love, still protect, still show up. And that is not a bad thing for her to learn." Grace grew up with Tolstoy II, grew up with a gray tabby cat who would sit beside her crib and watch over her. And Brian would watch this and see the cycle continuing, see another being learning to trust because someone was patient with them. And when Grace was 2 years old and Tolstoy II died peacefully at age 9, Brian held his daughter and explained that the cat had gone to sleep forever. And Grace cried and said, "Why?" And Brian said, "Because he was old and tired and it was time. But he loved you very much." And Grace said, "Will we get another Tolstoy?" And Brian looked at Emma and said, maybe someday." And Emma said, "Are you sure you want to keep doing this? Keep loving animals named Tolstoy?" And Brian said, "Yes, because every Tolstoy is a reminder of what I learned in Kabul, that even in the worst places you can find something worth saving, and that something is worth protecting." Brian adopted Tolstoy III in 2028, adopted another gray tabby from another bad situation, and Grace helped name him, said we should call him Tolstoy like the other ones. And Brian said, "Are you sure?" And Grace said, "Yes, because Tolstoy is a good name for cats who need someone who understands." And Brian picked up his 4-year-old daughter and said, "You are exactly right. That is exactly what the name means." And he adopted the cat and brought him home, and the cycle continued. The Protective Hearts support group grew to 3,000 members by 2029, grew to include not just veterans, but anyone who was protecting an animal from witnessing their trauma, included people with chronic illness, people recovering from accidents, people dealing with mental health crises, and they all shared the same understanding that sometimes love means separation, that sometimes the way you show up matters more than how quickly you show up. And Brian moderated this community, and he would post about his own struggles, about the ongoing process of healing, about how adopting traumatized cats was his way of staying connected to the first Tolstoy. And people would respond with their own stories, and the community became a place where protective love was understood and celebrated. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychologist who had first interviewed Brian, published a book in 2030 titled Protective Separation: Rethinking Animal Therapy and Trauma. And the book used Brian's story as the central case study, used it to argue for a complete reconceptualization of how we think about relationships between traumatized humans and traumatized animals. And the book argued that these relationships should not be understood as therapeutic interventions, but as partnerships in survival, as mutual agreements to protect each other from the memories that threaten to destroy both. And the book became required reading in veterinary psychology programs and military counseling programs. And Brian's decision to stay away from Tolstoy became a recognized model for trauma-informed animal care. Brian was invited to speak at the Pentagon in 2031, was invited to speak to military leadership about animal companionship and veteran mental health. And he stood in front of generals and colonels and told them about finding a kitten in Kabul, about staying away for months, about 8 years of mutual healing, about the work he was doing now with Protective Hearts. And he said, if you want to support veterans, you need to support their relationships with their animals. You need to understand that these are not pets. These are partners. These are beings who carry trauma alongside us. And we owe them the same care and consideration we owe our human battle buddies. And when Brian finished speaking, the room was silent. And then a four-star general stood up and started clapping. And the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Emma asked Brian in 2032, 16 years after he had first come home from Syria, if he still thought about the decision to stay away from Tolstoy, if he still believed it had been the right choice. And Brian said, I think about it every day. Think about it every time I look at Tolstoy III. Every time I work with a veteran who is making the same choice. Every time I talk to Grace about what it means to love someone who has been hurt. And yes, I still believe it was right. Still believe that those 4 months of separation bought me 8 years of peace with the first Tolstoy and taught me everything I know about what love actually requires. And Emma said, which is what? And Brian said, sacrifice, patience, the willingness to endure your own pain to prevent someone else's fear. And that is not easy, but it is real. It is the realest form of love I know. And if this story has shown you that love is not always about being together, that sometimes love means staying away until you can show up whole. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the sacrifices we make for those we love. Hit that like button if you understand that the hardest decisions are often the most loving decisions. And leave a comment sharing a time when you chose someone else's well-being over your own comfort. Because these stories matter. These moments when we prove that love is action, not just feeling, matter. They show us what we are capable of when we love something more than we love our own ease. And I will see you in the next story.